says international organizations and counterplans. That's maybe not 100% accurate. We're certainly going to be talking about international organizations as an option in counterplanning, but we're going to be talking a little bit more about international organizations in a number of different ways, disads, affirmative cases, that kind of stuff, not just specifically counterplanning, just to clarify. So let's start off by taking a look here, and this PowerPoint is on the Dropbox. I've finally gotten around to putting some of my PowerPoints on the Dropbox about 20 minutes ago. So let's first start off by kind of getting an idea for what international agreements are as opposed to international organizations and working from there, because I think that a lot of times, maybe not so much in debate, but I notice that in my classes at school when I teach that American students tend to be a little bit not very well versed on international affairs, right? This probably happens a little bit in debate as well, where people are less comfortable talking about international issues, foreign issues, than they are about domestic issues. And that's, you know, Americans tend to think that the whole world revolves around us. So it's in one way, I guess, understandable. But we need to understand what's going on in the world, because there's an awful lot happening there too. So trying to get a better and broader understanding of some of those issues and the way that they're happening. And I think that international organizations and agreements offer you a pretty interesting and unique way to access some of those debates, to talk about some interesting stuff, more than just simply, you know, the U.S. economy or hedge or whatever. Right? It's a little bit more of an interesting way, I personally think. And you know, you can learn a little bit more about issues going on in the world. So let's start off with international agreements. There are a number of different kinds of international agreements, and just because there are different types of agreements listed up here does not mean that there's not some overlap between them. Okay, just trying to make sure that we understand that there are different types. So bilateral agreements are essentially an agreement that's made between two states. It's not necessarily an organization. Right? An organization has various bodies within it, like a company or a nonprofit organization, or the United Nations has both, you know, the Security Council as well as the General Assembly, as well as dozens of other agencies and organizations within it. Right? An agreement is just an agreement. Right? It's maybe like a treaty. Okay, and so I'll give you a few examples of some of these as well. So a bilateral agreement is an agreement between two nations. Just two, that's why it says bilateral, two. And there are a few different examples of this. It might be a free trade agreement between two nations. Right? The United States has free trade agreements with individual nations around the world, and it's just our agreement with them. Right? So that would be an example. There are other things like cultural relationships that some countries have. For instance, India and Nepal have had a bilateral agreement with each other for so long that it existed before this guy named Buddha. Right? Been around for a long, long time. It still exists today, where Indian and Nepalese citizens are allowed to cross the border without a passport. They don't have to declare anything. It's just as if it's the same country. They don't really recognize the border for those purposes. They're allowed to own land and do business on both sides. Right? So there's just that historical relationship between them. There are Nepalese who have participated in the Indian Armed Forces. Right? So it goes back and forth. So that's maybe an example of that. There are also sometimes resource agreements between two nations. For instance, the United States and Canada have lots of fishing agreements with each other because we fish in the same waters, right? Or the fish that we fish cross the international border. We also have an international agreement or a bilateral agreement with Canada about the porcupine caribou herd up in this place we call the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR. That's when you get into ANWR debates about oil and everything. There's an international element because that porcupine caribou herd, there's like 120,000 of them in the herd. They don't pay attention to the border, right? They migrate across the border, and therefore it is a shared resource between both nations, which is why part of the debate about ANWR is we have to protect that caribou herd, because if we don't, we're in violation of our agreement with Canada. So that's kind of a different little bit of a twist on an ANWR debate, right? So that's the kind of thing we're talking about in terms of bilateral agreements. There also might be bilateral security agreements. Like we have a bilateral agreement with Iraq to maintain a certain level of force or trainers there. We have a bilateral agreement with Japan. We have a bilateral agreement with Taiwan in order to provide them defensive material as well as come to their assistance in case they're in need. Right? Those two countries having a relationship over something. Could be a number of different things. A multilateral agreement is an agreement that includes more than two countries, so lots of different countries. There might be, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act is, or Free Trade Agreement, sorry, is a multilateral agreement because it has more than one country. All the different WTO agreements that they have are, you might say they're multilateral agreements, even though they exist within a multilateral organization called the World Trade Organization. There are separate agreements within it, right? So any of those different trade agreements would be multilateral agreements that a number of different nations participate in. Security relationships that involve more than one country. Plurilateral agreements are a little bit different. A plurilateral agreement is an agreement between more than one country, multiple countries, but it's within an organization that not all members of that organization participate in that particular agreement. Let me try to clarify. For instance, you have the World Trade Organization, and all of the members of the World Trade Organization, however many there are, 100 and I don't know how many, right? There's lots. But there are some agreements within the World Trade Organization that not all members of the World Trade Organization are parties to a particular agreement. For instance, there's an agreement in the WTO about civilian aircraft industry. Not all nations that are part of the WTO have a civilian aircraft industry. There are about 20 or 30 that are part of that particular agreement within the larger confines of the WTO. Does that make sense what plurilateral agreements are? It involves many nations, but not necessarily all the nations within a particular organization. Right? So that's kind of another unique distinction to be made about some of these things. Another example of a plurilateral agreement might be the Schengen, and I'm not entirely certain that's how you pronounce it, but the Schengen area in Europe, that's the free passport zone. Right? We think of the EU, the European Union, but not all members of the EU are members of the Schengen zone. They're not all members of the free passport zone. You don't have to check your passport, you just go through. Right? Or they don't have any checks or customs, that kind of stuff. England and Ireland are not members. Right? Croatia is a member of the EU, but not a member of the Schengen zone. Right? I think there's one other, Cyprus. And one of those reasons is that 3 of those countries are islands, and so there's a little bit different issue with customs and borders and that kind of stuff. But they're agreements that exist within a larger body that not necessarily all members of the larger organization are party to. Okay? Economic agreements. I think economic agreements are pretty obvious. Those are trade agreements, those are customs unions, those are financial regulations, that kind of stuff. Security agreements or military agreements. They can, again, be multilateral or bilateral, but if they're multilateral, they're basically about collective security. Nations that join forces together in order to protect each other. Very obvious example is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All those nations work together to protect each other. An attack on any one of them is considered an attack on all of them. Right? Although not always, that's not always the case. For instance, how many of you remember a few years ago when Israel raided the Turkish flotilla? Right? The Turkish flotilla, the ships that were trying to break the blockade to go into Gaza to deliver humanitarian supplies to the people of the Gaza Strip. There were about 5 or 6 ships. Well, Israel didn't want them to get there, so they raided the ships. There was a little standoff and confrontation, and 9 people were killed. Right? And they were Turkish citizens. I think one was maybe a member of parliament or something, some kind of official figure. Turkey argued that it was an attack against Turkey. And if it's an attack against Turkey, guess what else it is? It's an attack against NATO. And so all of a sudden, this little, raid, flotilla raid, all of a sudden becomes, international scandal because all of a sudden NATO has to go, oh, we have a collective security agreement with these folks. And Israel just carried out sort of an attack, and so then they began this legal discussion about really what constitutes an attack. Was the flotilla illegally authorized, part of the Turkish government, all that kind of stuff. So interesting kind of stuff going on. Humanitarian agreements, where organizations sometimes produce agreements about the way people should be treated. Obviously, the more countries that sign on to them, the more credible they are. A very good example of a humanitarian agreement would be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR. Is the UDHR international law? Is it binding on anyone? No. It's not binding international law. It's an agreement. We try to go abide by it, but there were some countries that said, whoa, 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 we're not so ready to let you make universal human rights decisions for our country. Arab nations were a little unhappy about this idea. They said, look, we respect human rights, but we don't think that there should be any law above Islamic law. And so we're a little bit concerned about you implementing your Western notions on everybody else. Right? So a humanitarian agreement, being the UDHR, is a pretty good example of a humanitarian agreement. All right, so we're kind of getting the idea that there are a number of different types and levels to these international agreements that go on between nations. So let's take a look at international organizations, because an international agreement, remember, is not an international organization. It's an agreement between either two or more nations. Some of them take place within the framework or structure of an international organization, but some of them don't. So an international organization is just an organization of an international scope. Its membership is international. And that membership can be either intergovernmental or non-governmental. If it's intergovernmental, it just means that it has a government role, or government plays a large role in the makeup of the organization, of the structure. They agree to be bound by a certain set of rules and procedures. Right? And that's governmental in nature. That's like the United Nations. That is like the European Union. That's like the Organization of American States, or the African Union, or those organizations that involve governments. They might also involve non-governmental organizations, but these ones involve governmental bodies. Okay? Non-governmental organizations are simply those organizations that don't come from a government position. They're independent of government. Okay? So they are independent of government. So that's pretty important, just to understand that distinction between governmental organizations. For instance, the USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, is that what it's called?
That's right.
Yeah, so the U.S. Agency for International Development is a governmental organization, right? It's a government organization. Oxfam is a relief organization. They're non-governmental. So USAID is bound by the laws of its country or by the rules of its government, whereas Oxfam is not necessarily bound by governmental rules and processes and regulations. They're bound by law. Do you understand the distinction? Some are governmental in nature, some are not. Excuse me. The last thing, multinational, or sometimes it's called transnational, multinational or transnational corporations are just those businesses that operate globally, or at least beyond.
Like big oil.
Yeah, big oil, finance companies, Toyota, McDonald's, Coke, right? It could be any number of different types of industry, but it's just any particular company that operates beyond just one nation. And there is a lot of them, right? And they come from all over the world. Okay? They do have a home country where their headquarters are, and they also might have operations in other places that they call host countries. So they have a headquarters in a particular place, like Coke. Coke operates all over the world, but they have headquarters in the United States of America. Right? Sony operates all over the world, but they have headquarters in Japan. Right? So, or Vivendi has operations all over the world, but they have headquarters in, I think it's France, Belgium, and one or the other. Okay, so multinational corporations. So let's talk a little bit, are there any questions about that so far? I think that's all pretty basic, pretty straightforward. Okay. Multilateral versus unilateral, bilateral versus multilateral versus unilateral. Let's talk about some of the advantages of the different ones, because we've already differentiated between what bilateral action is between two nations, just between the two of them. Multilateral being between a lot of different nations working together. Unilateral being one, acting alone by yourself. Not in conjunction or in cooperation with others, but by yourself. One nation taking a particular action. So let's talk a little bit about some of the advantages of a bilateral agreement or bilateral action. First of all, it might be easier to actually negotiate, a bilateral agreement because there's only two nations involved. There's only two sets of interests as opposed to 20 sets of interests or 80 sets of interests, etc. So maybe it's a little bit easier and more efficient and gets done more quickly because there are fewer interests you have to take into account, fewer sets of needs, fewer sets of objectives and interests.
So if you wanted to reach a peace treaty with just one country, you don't need to get the United Nations involved.
Right. It's not really directly related to them, and so if you were to draw other countries into that, it would only complicate the process and make it even harder. U.S. leadership is probably easier to maintain within a bilateral setting, right? Because if it's just the United States negotiating with one other country, it's pretty easy for them to assert their leadership. But if all of a sudden they're negotiating with 50 countries, it's a little bit less easy to assert their leadership. Likewise, if the United States is trying to come to some kind of agreement with, Italy, it's a lot easier for the United States to assert its leadership and its dominance in that relationship than it would be with the EU, right? Because Italy doesn't have nearly as much influence vis-a-vis the United States as the European Union does as a whole. Okay, so it may be a little bit easier to negotiate and to maintain U.S. leadership if you think U.S. leadership is a positive thing for your advantage or disadvantage, whatever it happens to be. It also might avoid problems with particular organizations. You might say, well, it's a lot better to have just these two nations settle this issue because the UN's broken. The UN is political, they're inefficient, they're not able to get anything done because it'll just be the United States, China, and Russia bickering in the Security Council. They won't come to any agreement. What we really need is just the United States and country XYZ to come to an agreement and work it out between themselves, rather than involving a multilateral organization that's ineffective. Okay, so sometimes you might argue that there's a solvency, that there's greater solvency by just a bilateral relationship rather than a multilateral relationship. So what are some of the advantages of a multilateral agreement? Well, first of all, you distribute the responsibilities and the risks more widely. Rather than just two countries having to take on all of the risks of your bilateral agreement, now all of these different countries are spreading the risk around. So your shared responsibility and shared risks. There's also the potential for greater solvency and sustainability, because if you're trying to, let's say that the resolution is to significantly increase healthcare programs in sub-Saharan Africa, and your plan is to do XYZ in sub-Saharan Africa, and the counter plan is, why shouldn't we have the UN do this, or the African Union do this? And you might be able to make arguments about greater solvency and sustainability because you'll have better local connections. They speak the languages, they understand the cultures, they already have people on the ground that know what's going on and what's appropriate in certain areas, what's not appropriate in certain areas. You have a wider pool of knowledge. Some countries are really good with particular diseases or famines or agricultural problems than maybe the United States has expertise in. Right? And so you get a greater pool of speciality and so forth. You also, this last little piece is kind of important about shared ownership. Right? If the United States just goes in and does something, then it's questionable about how sustainable that will be. But if there are a lot of countries that are participating in the solution, it means you get buy-in and shared ownership. And when you have shared ownership, it's more likely that everybody will work cohesively together and collaborate cooperatively to make whatever your solution is more effective. You can also get into international credibility issues. You can make an argument that multilateral action avoids hedge U.S. hegemony, that you stop U.S. from being the bully in the world. Things like an imperialism or colonialism critique, or maybe a U.S. leadership bad disadvantage, right? Any number of different types of arguments you can make about imperialism, colonialism, neoliberalism, statism, etc., are all going to apply less to a multilateral approach than to a U.S.-centric approach. Yeah.
How would the neoliberalism arguments not apply stronger to a coalition of sorts?
Well, because when you think about it, if your argument is, U.S. leadership bad,
right,
that one's pretty obvious, I think, right? You're saying that a multilateral organization would not provide nearly as much direct U.S. leadership as the multilateral organization. You might have some trouble if you're saying that, counterplan, let's have the EU do it, and our disad is a colonialism disad, or a, neoliberal critique. Well, Europe's just as colonial as America's ever been, right?
Yep.
And so you would run into troubles like that. You might be able to say, at least the European Union has been the one that has pushed decolonization. They have grown up a little bit more, and they're more democratic because they're not in the position of power in the status quo, that they could use it to counterbalance U.S. interests in the world. You might be able to make the argument that at least the United Nations has the influence of the developing world's voice, right? The developing world certainly gets a voice in the UN, but they don't necessarily with the EU or with the United States. You could certainly get colonial advantages or net benefits if you were to say something like a regional organization, right? Instead of having the United States do this program, let's have the African Union do this, or let's have the Economic Cooperation Organization of West African states do this, right? That way you avoid the imperial power that comes in and exerts its imperial colonial will on the local area. Right? So you probably get a net benefit out of that. You also might avoid certain backlash disads. If you were to say, if there's a program to say, do X, Y, Z in Northern Africa, and your counterplan is, don't have the United States do that, have the Arab League do that program or policy, because you won't get nearly as much Arab nationalism and Islamic backlash if you use the Arab League as you would with the United States as an actor. Right? So you can garner some kind of net benefit from not using the United States as an actor. You might also be able to avoid disads that are directly related to U.S. action. Right? If you use the Arab League or the EU or the African Union or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations or whatever other organization, or Oxfam or some non-governmental organization, you're not going to probably link to your politics disad about the comprehensive immigration reform. You're probably not going to link to your U.S. deficit spending disad. Right? So those, I think, are pretty obvious types of net benefits that you might use to get out of externalities to U.S., negative externalities to U.S. action, ways for you to avoid that. Some of the advantages of unilateral action, because sometimes you want to say, forget this bilateral, multilateral agreement, let's be nice to everybody. We should have unilateral action because that's the best way to get things done. You might be able to argue that U.S. leadership is good. The United States needs to assert its hegemony because a strong unipolar world prevents conflict. You might be able to argue that it would be more efficient and greater solvency because when we operate in some of these up here, these multilateral organizations, you have to engage in politics. The United States has tried to get, and the Western nations have tried to get 3 different resolutions passed on Syria in the UN Security Council and do something about the situation, but each and every time Russia has just been there to say, nope, nope, nope. Every time the world has tried to do something about Israel-Palestine, the United States is there to say, nope, 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 and politics can override or trump or veto efforts to solve the problem. So unilateral action might avoid that and therefore be more efficient and more urgent in solving a problem. You don't have to coordinate with anybody. You just send the most equipped and most powerful nation in the world into the region to deal with the problem and get it taken care of quickly. A humanitarian disaster relief or natural disaster relief. Let's not take the time to coordinate amongst all these different nations, who's going to do what. The United States is very capable of responding to any crisis in the world. They can do it faster and better than anyone. Get in there and do it because people are suffering. Let's not sit around and waste our time figuring out which flag is going to be applied to the side of the box, whose planes are going to transport what, which airport are we going to use, which language are we going to use for our press releases, how are we going to communicate across our different communications systems and networks. No, let's avoid all of that. Let's have one organization go in and get the job done. Right? So you can make arguments for unilateral action being the best. You don't need to compromise, you don't need to engage in politics, etc. And sometimes you avoid the specific problems of particular organizations. Some organizations would be great for the African Union to be able to do everything in Africa, but they're resource strapped. They don't have the funds to be able to do a lot of the programs that the United States would be able to do, or the EU would be able to do, or etc. You might also be able to avoid the internal politics of a particular organization. I think we already kind of talked about that with the UN, the problems that the UN has. Does that kind of make sense? That there are advantages to each of these different approaches. There are also disadvantages to each of these individual approaches. Now, first of all, the advantages of the other kinds of approaches in some ways become disads to each of these other individual approaches. For example, the advantages of doing things multilaterally is kind of a disadvantage of doing things unilaterally, or at least it's an opportunity cost. It's something you lose out. When you act unilaterally, you don't get the benefits of acting multilaterally or bilaterally. So bilateral problems, they're a little bit limited in scope. There are only two nations, and maybe the issue is much larger than two nations. A free trade agreement with one particular country is not going to be able to solve international economic problems, because international economic problems are far bigger than just the trade between two particular countries.
So
a lot of resource issues.
Do we get a lot of redundancies then too?
I'm sorry?
Do we get a lot of redundancies then too? If we
Yeah,
have,
of
say,
course.
U.S. and Japan has their own trade agreement, then there's a UN trade agreement.
Sure, absolutely.
And so then it creates a conflict. If one of them wants to dissolve the other, they can't.
Yeah.
They still can't do
Why don't we have one big, broad policy that's more uniform and comprehensive rather than this piecemeal approach of little one here, little one there, little one here, little one there. Let's have a bigger, broader approach that's more comprehensive in scope and nature. Right? Yeah, absolutely. In addition, you might have an unequal relationship where the United States is overwhelmingly too powerful with their bilateral partner, which means it's not really a fair agreement. It might be less sustainable because you don't have as many different pools of resources and experts and perspectives and people that are supporting the project. Some of the disadvantages of a multilateral agreement: sometimes they're less efficient. We already talked about that. They take a little bit of time to get things done. There's bickering and there's logistical issues and so forth. They're more political. And sometimes there's a threat to sovereignty. The United States in particular does not necessarily like to do things through the United Nations. Why don't they like to do things through the United Nations? Because that's a potential threat to their sovereignty. The United States does not like anyone telling them what to do. The United States does not like anyone having authority over their armed services, right, or their personnel in the armed forces. They don't like them having control over their economy. They don't like them having control over their justice system, right? And so they would say, no, we don't do multilateral stuff because we don't want anybody else telling us what to do. Which is one of the reasons the United States is one of, what, like 5 countries that has not signed on and ratified this thing called the, the Convention to End all Discrimination Against Women. Doesn't that seem like a pretty good idea for the nations of the world to say, hey, why don't we do things to stop violence against women? This seems like a pretty good idea. The United States claims to be a champion of human rights, right? And we're one of 6 countries that has not ratified Csto, which means we're right there with, Sudan, I think Somalia, right? It's not very good company. Right? And so we do that not because the United States hates women, although some people will make that argument, and there are probably some valid claims to be made there, right? But we do that primarily because we don't want to submit to the jurisdiction and authority of anyone other than our own national sovereignty. We don't want anyone else being able to tell us what to do. And so we would say that CDAW has certain mechanisms within it that would contravene our sovereignty. If it were written a little bit differently, we'd be okay with it, but we have some concerns about the enforcement measures and that kind of stuff, right? What else? Where were we at? Advantages of unilateral actions. Oh, I'm sorry, that should have said disadvantages. I need to fix that, it's a typo. Disadvantages of unilateral actions. Obviously, there's higher risk of negative reactions. Other countries will backlash or freak out. They don't like what we did, and so they get angry, increases tensions, increases arms race, makes somebody decide not to go through with that trade agreement that we had been talking about, whatever. Okay, there's some negative reaction by some either country or individual group in a particular country. And also it's less likely to be sustainable. A lot of times the United States has these great ideas to build health care in the poor and developed nations, to resolve some human rights issue in some poor developing nation. They go in there, somebody passes an affirmative plan in a debate round, and therefore the United States Congress reacts and sends somebody down to South Central Africa, and they have this little program that exists for 6 months, and they do some good work, and then they leave. And guess what? It all falls apart because there's nobody there, no local leadership to sustain the project. Right? And that happens with a lot of humanitarian issues around the world, where well-intentioned, well-meaning human rights organizations or development agencies go into a part of the world and they try to fix some problem, and while they're there, the problem is a little bit resolved, but as soon as their 6-month or 12-month or whatever time frame on their program is up or their funding runs out, they say, oh cool, we did this good thing, things look good, we're out of here, and then it breaks down following their departure. Because they built these funky wells, so that people can draw water, they're really high tech, and then they leave, the well breaks, and there's nobody around that knows how to fix it. Right? Or they provide them with top-level medical care, and then they leave, but they didn't train anybody in how to continue to offer that medical assistance after they leave. And so it's great for 6 months, but it's not sustainable. It breaks down because there's no way to keep it going and keep it moving. So, advantages and disadvantages to bilateral, multilateral, and unilateral. And that's going to be a pretty interesting debate in some of these rounds that you'll be in. It's a very interesting debate in the actual literature. What's best? What's best? Bilateral agreements, multilateral organizations, or just powerful nations acting independently and individually unilaterally? Right? And I would suggest to you that it depends on the unique situation. It depends on the circumstances. One of them is not best in all circumstances. It depends on the particular issue you're talking about, which one will be best. So let's talk about some examples of international organizations that you might use in some of these debate rounds. Economic and financial organizations, obviously things like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, can provide development assistance and loans to countries. The World Trade Organization can handle trade disputes. The G8 is the group of 7 most powerful nations plus Russia. Right? They added Russia in order to make the Russians feel good, but the Russians are also powerful economically, so it makes sense to have them there. The G20. The G20 is not necessarily the top 20 ranked economies in the world. There are a couple that are outside the top 20, like Spain is not a member of the G20, even though they have a top 20 economy. There are enough European nations in the G20 that Spain doesn't necessarily need to be there, so they invite a couple others outside that, like Saudi Arabia, I think is outside of the top 20, but they're a member of the G20 because they're an important country, etc. The G20 is becoming increasingly important. Those top 20 economies are increasingly setting international economic policy, not the G8. Some of those countries have become powerful enough economically that they can't be ignored anymore, and they want to be a part of the decision-making process. So the G20 is where a lot more of the more significant economic and financial trends and patterns are being set, rather than the G8. We're starting to see economic power devolve to a larger group of nations. We already talked a little bit about USAID. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation is all of the nations that are on the Pacific, basically border the Pacific Ocean. and they work to come up with economic policies that benefit all of them. OPEC, you all know what OPEC is, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC is obviously important whenever you get into any energy kind of debates, and you could use them as an agent. You could also make a disad to say OPEC won't like your policy, they'll backlash, and they will manipulate the price of oil. The United States will be hamstrung because we're so dependent on foreign sources of oil that it will harm our economy. Regional trade blocs like the EU, ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, microloan organizations, all of those different groups have different advantages or disadvantages to using them as opposed to a particular country. Okay, so they could serve as pretty good organization to use. Security organizations, there are lots of them. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, we all roughly know what NATO is. The SCO, anyone know what the SCO is? What is it, Jonathan?
Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Shanghai Cooperation Organization is essentially, there are a few more countries involved, but it's essentially Russia and China trying to counterbalance the United States and the West, NATO. So it's a little bit like NATO, but it's not quite as strictly a defensive military relationship. It also has cultural and economic purposes. And some of the main things that the SCO deals with are terrorism. It deals with terrorism and the drug trade in that particular region. The NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Conference on Disarmament, Chemical Weapons Conference, Biological Weapons Conference, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is a pretty important one. That's almost like NATO, except that it involves Russia too. There's like 50 some odd different nations in the OSCE, and it's an effort to say, hey everybody, let's make sure nobody overreacts. Let's make sure that everybody kind of is chill about our international relations, and when there are problems, we dialogue about it. We have negotiations, we have conversations, rather than somebody doing something, rash and, overreacting, miscalculating. Let's all be a little bit careful. So it's an important and powerful one. The IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, is the UN's nuclear watchdog. They're the ones that go into Iran and want to hold inspections of their nuclear facilities. The MFO is a pretty interesting one. Anyone know what the MFO is? Multinational Forces Operations. Multinational Forces Operations. It's like a peacekeeping organization specific to the Sinai Peninsula. It's the only place that it operates in the world. It is not a UN peacekeeping operation. It is predominantly European as well as North American, Canada, the United States, and Australian troops that are present in the Sinai Peninsula with the intent of keeping the peace between Egypt and Israel, enforcing the treaty. So whenever you get into Egypt or Israel debates, MFO makes for a pretty interesting twist on some of those debates. And it's something that a lot of people don't know anything about. It's something that a lot of people will not be prepared to answer and respond to, but it essentially keeps the peace between Egypt and Israel. Pretty important. UN peacekeeping operations, obviously, around the world are important. The Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, is essentially Russia's reaction to NATO. Right? It's kind of Russia plus the stands, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Right? It's essentially those countries, and I think maybe Armenia or Azerbaijan, one of the two, is still a member. Guam, not the little island Guam, but Guam is an organization that includes Georgia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and Moldova, former Soviet Union, Soviet nations that have formed their own collective security agreement. It's not as strong as NATO in terms of its collective security agreement, but they agree to kind of help each other out, right? Interpol is the international police, ISAF, international security. What's ISAF? International Security Assistance Forces. That's NATO's operation in Afghanistan. If you're debating NATO, or I'm sorry, if you're debating an Afghanistan topic, you're probably going to debate ISAF, or at least you need to know about it and understand that it's really NATO that runs the show in Afghanistan, or at least the command structure. Legal organizations, the World Court, the International Court of Justice, the ICC is the International Criminal Court. They handle different types of cases. International war crimes tribunals can be set up on an ad hoc basis for particular situations, right? Like Rwanda or Yugoslavia. We might see one in, maybe Burma would be a nice place to see one, right? That kind of thing. Maybe the Congo, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, etc. Somalia. Environmental organizations. International Panel on Climate Change is very important. It's kind of the UN's organization to deal with climate change issues. International Whaling Commission, various fishing agreements, the various UN organizations, the UN Environmental Program, the UN Law of the Sea, Convention on the Law of the Sea. But then this is an area where we start to see more non-governmental organizations coming to play. Greenpeace, Nature Conservancy, etc. That they can take actions and efforts. Okay? Humanitarian organizations, there are lots of different UN bodies, the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, the Human Rights Council, UNICEF, the UN Development Program, all UN organizations that you could use to say, let's let the UN organization deal with that rather than the United States. It's what they're good at. They have people in all these different countries, they speak the languages, they are culturally sensitive, right, etc. Plus, independent organizations, non-governmental organizations like Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, etc. A couple more, and then I want to talk a little bit about some of the positions that you can use them for in debate rounds. But regional organizations, the European Union, the Organization of American States, the African Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Commonwealth of Independent States. That is, again, former Soviet nations. The Arab League, CARICOM, is in the Caribbean. Mercosur is in South America. Union of South American Nations, ALBA, I don't remember, it's a Spanish, the name of it is in Spanish, and I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's the Bolivarian nations, it's the leftist-leaning nations. There are about a dozen of them, nations like Venezuela, Honduras, places like Cuba, Ecuador, Nicaragua, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua, I think I said that, Bolivia, some of those nations that are a little bit more leftist. They want to kind of say, we want to stop U.S. imperialism, and so they have their own little organization that they try to work together and help each other out. The GCC is the Gulf Cooperation Council. That's essentially the Gulf Arab countries in the Persian Gulf. They might call it the Arab Gulf, right? Because they're Arabs, so they would call it the Arab Gulfs. The SAARC is the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, I think. South Asian, it's essentially the South Asian nations like Nepal, Bhutan, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that work together for issues of economic development, cultural development, etc. ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States. SADC is South African Development Cooperation or Council or something like that. This last one's kind of interesting. CELAC is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. The OAS up there at the top, the Organization of American States, is essentially like the UN for the Western Hemisphere, right? And so they handle a lot of humanitarian issues, democracy promotion, environmental protection, human rights, economic cooperation, that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of criticism of the OAS because a lot of the Latin American countries will say that it's too heavily dominated by who?
Yes.
By the United States.
Those Canadians.
Right, by the United States, and the Canadians. So, a couple of years ago, they created something new called the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. It's all of the OAS minus the United States and Canada. They're not invited to the party. They said, nope, the Americans and the Canadians, you're not on the inside. You're not on the in-group. Right? So it's an effort to counterbalance U.S. influence in the region. So when you get debates about Central America, South America, the Caribbean, that might be a good place to look. because it would be a counterplan that would help you to avoid American imperialism disadvantages, right? And you also get an easy net benefit to say, and it doesn't cause an American politics disad, and it doesn't cause an American deficit spending disad, right? And so you get a lot of net benefits, but you get regional cohesion advantages, you get CLAC stability or credibility advantages, right? Last one, there's some special relationships around the world. The Organization of Islamic Countries, I've heard it called the Organization of Islamic Council, the Organization of Islamic Conference, but it's the Organization of Islamic Countries. There's like 54, 57, and they're all the countries that are predominantly Islamic. So if you have a resolution that is do something in some Islamic nation, seems like here's an international organization that would be able to adapt really well and work very well in those places and not cause cultural tensions by having the United States step in and tell an Islamic country what to do, right? So again, a fairly good option. The non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement's pretty old. It's the group of nations that were neither aligned with Russia, neither aligned with the Soviet Union, nor the United States. They said, we're not going to take place in this East-West Cold War. We're not going to align ourselves with either side. Okay, that's also kind of what this G77 is. The nations that are not aligned with either the East-West split. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they're kind of working together because they're the up-and-coming international powers. So that might be a place where you could put together a disadvantage or a counter plan. The Roman Catholic Church, the Commonwealth of Nations, International Olympic Committee, the FIFA, which is the International Soccer Association. So those can all be alternative actors to help you solve some kind of problem, right? That you don't want the United States and the big, imperial bully taking a role in that situation. You can use some alternative organization that can maybe solve those issues a little bit with a little bit more cultural sensitivity, with a little bit more sustainability, etc. So, what are some of the things you can use in a debate round? How can you execute these issues? On the negative, obviously they provide for counterplan ground, alternative actor counterplans, or maybe even consultation counterplans, although consultation counterplans are rapidly becoming unpopular in parliamentary debate for whatever reason, whether that's good or bad. Some of the things that they might offer you. It avoids U.S. relations, backlash, and freak-out disadvantages because you don't have the United States imposing itself on whatever region or country you're talking about. It avoids U.S. politics and credibility disads, which we've already talked about. You don't run the risk of Senator so-and-so from state such and such getting upset about your plan and therefore taking all of his or her toys home and not playing with the other senators on the next piece of legislation that's about to come up on the docket. Right? You don't even have to bother with all that political crap. You just bypass it and say, this other country will do it, so there won't be a political backlash in the Senate or the House or wherever. It also avoids the econ disads for the United States, etc. Sometimes you might be able to argue that you get superior solvency. But it's important, as I mentioned there, it's important to remember that superior solvency alone is not competition. Just because you solve better doesn't mean that you can't do both of them together. There has to be some other reason why you can't do them together. I say that I can, chop down 5 trees in an hour. Jonathan says, yeah, well, I can chop down 10 trees in an hour. And I say, yeah, but together we can chop down 15. All right? So just because he can do more than I can doesn't mean it's competitive. That make sense? What else? You can use it to isolate a particular advantage. The affirmative has 2 different advantages, and you can counterplan out of one. Sorry, I should use the other finger. One of them, and that remains that leaves one other advantage that you have to deal with instead of 2 advantages to deal with. So a counterplan on a specific advantage makes a lot of sense just to make it go away and focus on the other advantage. Now, some of the affirmative answers to these counterplans. They're highly susceptible to permutations. Have the United States and agent XYZ work together, right? Better solvency, more people working on the issue. They can also become a little bit more complicated by saying, well, okay, let's have the AU the African Union do the actual physical work. Let's have the United States provide all the funding and the training to make it happen. That's a permutation. It's maybe an intrinsic permutation, maybe a severance permutation, but nevertheless, you know, they're open to permutation. So you got to be a little bit careful with that. You have to have some reason why any U.S. involvement is bad. Politics dissat, spending dissat, local backlash on the ground from people that don't like imperial behavior from, you know, the Western colonial powers, that kind of stuff. There might also be disadvantages to the alternative actor that you pick. You know, we already talked about some of them have problems with politics, some of them are corrupt, some of them are whatever. If you run a counterplan to say, let's have the OAS or the African Union, let's have the African Union do it instead, a disadvantage to that might be, hey, guess what? There's this place called Darfur and this place called Somalia where the OAU is, the AU, the African Union, is pretty tied down. They're really active in those areas, and you just mandated with your counterplan that they do something over here in Mali. The only way they'll be able to do that is to pull their troops, their peacekeeping troops, out of the existing operations in Somalia and Sudan and move them over to Mali, because you didn't put into your counterplan that you would increase the number of peacekeeping troops. Where are they going to come from? There's a shortage of peacekeeping troops in the world, in Africa. So there can be disadvantages to using a particular actor as well. There might be solvency deficits. Your agency or your organization or your actor doesn't have as good of technology as the United States has. They don't have experts to be able to make this happen, right? There might be questions about the legitimacy of multinational actor fiat. Someone will say, you can't fiat a multilateral organization. That's fiating the actions of 180 different countries. You can make that argument. I think that most people in the community will accept that you can fiat any one particular international organization, right? But you might hear that argument. You might run credibility disadvantages for a specific organization. The SCO, as we mentioned before, you might be in a debate where you would say SCO credibility is on the brink. They need something to give them a little bit of prestige in order for them to be able to solve their terrorism problems, and our counterplan gives them that little shot in the arm that they need. It makes them look good. Therefore, they're able to come to an agreement with China and Russia are able to come to an agreement about how to handle terrorism. The impact is decreased terrorism, hysteria, dirty bomb, whatever. Okay, so that you might be able to come up with some external advantage, but in that case you have to win the uniqueness. You really have to win the uniqueness of that dissat. Finally, you can maybe use it as defense of the status quo. Inherency isn't really much of a voting issue anymore, but it will take away the significance of the affirmative case by saying, you know what, there's already this organization working on this issue. There's already this international actor that has just last month designated a $250 million project to solve that problem. They're already working on it. Stay out of their way. Your plan will just go in there and mess things up. We won't know who to talk to. It'll cause miscommunication. It causes duplicity. It's too expensive. Whatever. It's already being taken care of. On the affirmative, there are not a ton of things you can do with international organizations unless the resolution is written in such a way that you can use a different actor for your plan actor. If the resolution says Japan should repeal its, well, that's not, I mean, it is an international actor, but you might have resolutions that say the EU should do X, Y, Z. Or you might have a couple of years ago at Nationals, didn't we have a resolution that said the Catholic Church should X, Y, Z, right? And that threw everybody for a loop, right? Or at least the non-Catholics threw them for a loop. They were saying, oh, we don't know how that works. And some of the Catholics were even probably saying, oh, we don't really know how it works either. But it certainly gave them an advantage because they understood it a little bit, right? And so you might be in a situation where you see that happen. You might also be able to use it as uniqueness to disadvantages. You know, when people are saying this would cause this problem, non-unique, the EU has already been kind of doing this, that should have caused your disad. The SCO has already taken action XYZ, that should have already caused Iran to freak out. Whatever it might be, you can use that as arguments against other issues too. We have just a couple minutes here. I just want to say one more thing. debating about these kind of issues, international and regional organizations can be very strategic, educational, and a lot of fun, but they can be very, very complicated. And I know that I was speaking quickly. We are covering a lot of material very, very fast, very, very quickly. We're not going into depth in any of those particular issues. That's why if you want to engage in debates about international organizations and trade blocs and regional organizations, non-governmental organization counterplans, those are all really highly, highly strategic arguments and positions, but you have to know what you're talking about, which means you have to do a little bit of research into them. You have to figure out how they work. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What ways do they operate that make them more sustainable than U.S. action? Right? Because whenever you get a resolution about a particular region in the world, I would always advise negative teams to at least consider, what about a regional organization counterplan? Have the OAS do it. Have the African Union do it. Have the Association of Southeast Asian Nations do it. Have ECOWAS do it. Have the EU do it. Have whatever local organization, because you're probably going to get some advantages right off the bat because they understand their own region better than we understand the region. There's also less likelihood that the people in that region are going to backlash and be angry about one of their own organizations acting in their region than they would about the United States coming in with one more colonial, neoliberal policy to impose upon people. You also avoid U.S. politics disads. You also avoid U.S. economic disads, debt disads, and spending trade-off disads and that kind of stuff. So you've got a lot of net benefits that are built in pretty quickly. You also can run them with their critical positions. It avoids imperialism, it avoids capitalism, it avoids neoliberal, yada, 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 right? And so they're pretty consistent with those kinds of positions, but you have to understand them. You have to understand the cultural advantages that they have. You have to understand the local resources that they have access to. Right? You have to be able to explain how, actually the OAS has people who are really skilled in dealing with cholera, because they do. Right? They're the primary responders to situations where there's cholera outbreak. Who's the first to respond? OAS. Right? Or Red Cross, but you find somebody who responds quickly and better in a particular situation, and you're automatically one step ahead of the affirmative because you can say, first, we solve every bit as well as you would be able to solve. Secondarily, we avoid some disadvantage that you would cause that we don't cause. We solve better, and you shouldn't do a combination of the two because United States action, even in a small regard, undercuts your solvency, causes some other disadvantage, makes, Senator Sensenbrenner upset, makes, whatever. Right? You find some way to explain why your organization would be better to solve it alone rather than a combination of the United States and your organization. And that's not too difficult. You have lots of options. We just named them. And there are probably another 80 that haven't been named. Okay? So it's fun stuff, but it's also complicated, which means you have to dig in and really do some research on it.